The first $500 fine from the Maple Grove Homeowners Association landed in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning in early November, and I knew right then that Susan Grayson was behind it. I'm Keith Anderson, and I had been living in the Maple Grove subdivision of Plymouth, Minnesota, for about 3 years when this whole mess started. My house sat at the corner of Birch Street and Maple Drive, right where the development met the old county road that led into town. It was a nice enough place, with those cookie-cutter houses that all looked vaguely similar but different enough that you could tell them apart if you paid attention. The HOA was strict, but I had never had much trouble with them before. I kept my lawn mowed, my mailbox painted, and my garbage cans hidden from street view like the covenants required. But apparently, stockpiling road salt in my detached garage was crossing some invisible line I didn't know existed. The letter was typed on official HOA letterhead, signed by Susan Grayson herself, the HOA president. It stated in no uncertain terms that my excessive storage of commercial quantities of road salt was in violation of Section 12, subsection D of the Community Covenants, which prohibited running a business from a residential property. The fine was $500, payable within 30 days, and if I didn't remove the salt within 2 weeks, additional fines would accrue at $100 per day. I read the letter 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rise with each pass. Commercial quantities. Business. I had bought 20 bags of rock salt from the hardware store. 20. It was early November, and anyone with half a brain knew that Minnesota winters could be brutal. Last year, we had gotten slammed with ice storms in January and February, and the stores had sold out of salt within hours. I had spent 2 weeks sliding down my driveway like it was an Olympic luge track, watching my 72-year-old neighbor Mrs. Henderson fall twice trying to get her mail. So this year, I had decided to be prepared. I bought the salt on sale in October, stacked it neatly in my garage where nobody could even see it unless they were actively snooping, and figured I was being a responsible homeowner. Apparently, Susan Grayson disagreed. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA office number listed on the letter. It rang 4 times before Susan's nasal voice answered. Maple Grove Homeowners Association, this is Susan speaking. Susan, this is Keith Anderson on Birch Street. I just got your letter about the salt in my garage, and I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Oh, there's no misunderstanding, Mr. Anderson. Her voice took on that particular tone that middle-aged suburban women perfect over years of complaining to retail managers. You're storing commercial quantities of road salt, which clearly indicates business operations. I bought 20 bags for personal use, for my driveway and sidewalk. That's not a business. 20 bags is excessive for personal use. The board has determined that anything over 6 bags constitutes commercial quantity. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. Where in the covenants does it say that? Section 12, subsection D clearly states, I read it. It says no businesses. It doesn't say anything about how many bags of salt I can keep in my own garage for personal use. The board interprets that section to include your current violation. The fine stands, Mr. Anderson. You have 2 weeks to remove the excess salt or additional fines will apply. Have a good day. She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, staring at my phone, absolutely floored by what had just happened. The salt was in my garage. My closed garage, which meant someone had been looking in my windows or had somehow gotten access to see inside. The only way Susan could have known about it was if she had been actively spying on me. That evening, I drove over to my buddy Ryan's house, a few blocks away. Ryan had lived in Maple Grove for 7 years and had his own run-ins with the HOA over the years. Nothing major, just the usual petty stuff about grass height and Christmas decorations staying up too long. "She's counting your salt bags," Ryan asked, handing me a beer as we sat in his living room. That's insane even for Susan. She had to have looked in my garage window. That's the only way she could have seen them. Probably. She walks the neighborhood every morning with her phone, taking pictures of anything she thinks might be a violation. Last year, she tried to find the Johnsons because their pumpkins were still on their porch on November 3rd. Said seasonal decorations had to come down within 48 hours of the holiday. Did they pay it? Hell no. They fought it, and the board backed down. Susan throws these fines around hoping people will just pay them instead of challenging her. Ryan took a sip of his beer. "You should come to the next board meeting. It's next Wednesday. Tell them the fine is bogus." "I might do that." "You definitely should, and Keith, don't remove the salt. If you do, she'll think she can bully you into anything." I left Ryan's house feeling a bit better. He was right. This was a ridiculous fine based on a ridiculous interpretation of the rules. I wasn't running a business. I was preparing for winter like any sensible person would. The next week crawled by. I went to work at the civil engineering firm where I had worked for the past 8 years, came home, lived my life, and tried not to think about the salt in my garage. But it nagged at me, the principle of the thing. The fact that Susan Grayson thought she could tell me I couldn't store salt in my own garage. Wednesday evening arrived, and I drove to the community clubhouse for the HOA board meeting. The clubhouse was a nice enough facility, with a small gym, a pool that was closed for the season, and a meeting room that the board used for their monthly gatherings. About 15 other residents were there, which was actually a pretty good turnout. Usually, these meetings only drew 4 or 5 people. Susan sat at the front table with the other 4 board members. Tom Richardson, the vice president, Linda McCarthy, the secretary, and 2 at-large members whose names I could never remember. Susan was exactly what you'd picture when someone said, HOA president. She was 53 years old, had that particular haircut that soccer moms get when they want to speak to the manager, and wore pressed khakis and a cardigan like it was her uniform. "Good evening, everyone," Susan said, calling the meeting to order at 7 o'clock sharp. "We have quite a bit to cover tonight, so let's get started. First item is the approval of last month's minutes." The meeting droned on through the usual business. Approval of minutes, financial reports, discussion about holiday lighting guidelines, a debate about whether the community entrance sign needed repainting. I waded through all of it, my turn coming during the open comment period at the end. "Yes, Mr. Anderson," Susan said when I raised my hand, her voice already taking on a defensive edge. She knew why I was there. I stood up. "I'm here about the fine I received for storing salt in my garage. I think there's been a misunderstanding about what constitutes commercial activity." "There's no misunderstanding. The board has reviewed your situation and the fine is appropriate. I bought 20 bags of salt for personal use on my driveway and sidewalk. That's not a business. I'm not selling it. I'm not advertising services. I'm preparing for winter." 20 bags is excessive for personal use," Susan said, her voice rising slightly. "It indicates commercial intent. Based on what standard? Where in our covenants does it specify how many bags of salt is too many?" Susan's face was starting to flush. "The board has the authority to interpret the covenants as necessary to maintain community standards. So you made up a number. 6 bags is okay, but 20 isn't. Did you do any research into average salt usage? Did you consider that some of us have longer driveways? Did you consider that last winter the stores sold out and nobody could buy salt for weeks? Mr. Anderson, this isn't a debate. The fine has been issued. If you wish to appeal, you can submit a written request to the board for review. I shouldn't have to appeal a bogus fine in the first place. Tom Richardson leaned forward, trying to play mediator. Keith, the board is just trying to prevent people from running businesses out of their homes. It affects property values when homes are being used for commercial purposes. I'm not running a business. I'm storing salt in my garage where nobody can even see it unless they're looking in my windows, which, by the way, is the only way Susan could have known it was there. A few other residents murmured at that. Susan's face went from flushed to red. I was performing a routine inspection of the community, she said sharply. By looking in garage windows, I could see from the street. My garage windows are 6 feet off the ground and face the side yard. You'd have to deliberately go onto my property and look in to see anything. The murmuring got louder. Susan grabbed her gavel and banged it once on the table. This discussion is over. The fine stands unless you submit a formal appeal. Next item. I sat down, frustrated but not surprised. Ryan had warned me that the board rarely backed down during meetings. The formal appeal process was my next step. Over the next few days, I put together my appeal. I printed out the section of the covenant Susan had cited, highlighting the part about businesses. I pulled my receipts from the hardware store showing I had purchased the salt for personal use. I wrote a detailed letter explaining why 20 bags was reasonable for a Minnesota winter, citing last year's salt shortage and the length of my driveway compared to others in the neighborhood. I even included weather data from the National Weather Service showing average snowfall for our area. I submitted the appeal on Monday, as required, by hand delivering it to Susan's house. She answered the door in yoga pants and another cardigan, took the envelope from me without a word, and closed the door in my face. The appeal hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, another Wednesday evening meeting. This time I brought printouts of everything for the board to review. I presented my case calmly and logically, walking through each point. I showed my receipts, my weather data, my calculations for how much salt I would need for the winter based on my driveway square footage. Susan sat through all of it with her arms crossed, her face set in that particular expression of someone who had already made up their mind and was just waiting for you to finish talking so she could say no. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson," she said when I finished. "The board will review your appeal and notify you of our decision within 10 business days. Can I ask a question? What is it? If the board rejects my appeal and I still refuse to pay the fine or remove the salt, what happens then?" Susan's lips pressed into a thin line. "Continued violations will result in increasing fines and potential legal action to enforce the covenants. Eventually, we can place a lien on your property. For storing salt in my garage, for violating community covenants that you agreed to when you purchased your home." I left the meeting knowing exactly what was going to happen. The board would reject my appeal, Susan would continue to escalate, and this was going to turn into a much bigger fight than anyone wanted. I was right. The rejection letter arrived 8 days later. The board had reviewed my appeal and determined that the original fine was appropriate and would stand. I now had 6 days remaining of my original 2-week deadline to remove the excess salt or face additional daily fines. I called a lawyer. His name was Marcus Chen, and he specialized in HOA disputes. I found him through a Google search and a lot of positive reviews from people who had fought their HOAs over various issues. His office was in downtown Minneapolis, and I met with him on a Friday afternoon after taking a half-day off work. So she's fining you for storing salt in your garage, Marcus said, reviewing the documents I had brought. And she's claiming it violates the business restriction in your covenants. Right. I'm not running a business. I'm just prepared for winter. Marcus flipped through the covenant documents, his eyes scanning the relevant sections. This is pretty cut and dry in your favor, honestly. The covenant clearly restricts business operations, but personal storage of supplies doesn't fall under that. Her interpretation is a reach, and not a good one. Can she really keep fining me? She can issue the fines, but enforcing them is another matter. HOAs have authority, but it's not unlimited. If this went to court, I'm confident you'd win. The question is whether you want to go through that fight. What are my options? You can pay the fine and remove the salt, which I don't recommend because it sets a precedent that she can bully you into compliance. You can ignore the fines and let her try to escalate, which will probably end up in court eventually. Or you can fight it now, push back hard and make it clear that you're not going to be intimidated. What would fighting it now look like? Marcus leaned back in his chair. I send a letter to the HOA on your behalf, laying out the legal reasons why the fine is invalid and why her interpretation of the covenants won't hold up in court. That often makes boards reconsider because they realize the HOA will have to pay legal fees to pursue it, and they'll probably lose. If she doesn't back down, we file a lawsuit challenging the fine and seeking attorney fees. How much would that cost me? I can start with the letter for a flat fee of $500. If it goes to litigation, we're looking at a retainer and hourly billing, but if we win, we'd seek to recover your attorney fees from the HOA. In cases like this where the HOA is clearly overreaching, courts often award fees to the homeowner. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. The principle of this whole thing had gotten under my skin. I wasn't going to let Susan Grayson bully me into paying a bogus fine for being prepared for winter. Send the letter. Marcus smiled. I'll have it drafted and sent by Monday. I left his office feeling better than I had in weeks. Finally, someone was pushing back against Susan's nonsense with actual legal weight behind it. The letter went out on Monday as promised. Marcus sent me a copy. It was beautifully written, laying out in clear legal language why the fine was invalid, why the HOA's interpretation of the business covenant was unsupported by the actual text, and why continued enforcement would result in litigation that the HOA would likely lose while being liable for my attorney fees. Susan must have received it on Tuesday because I got a phone call from her on Wednesday morning. I was at work, sitting at my desk reviewing engineering plans, when my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. Mr. Anderson, this is Susan Grayson. I received a letter from your attorney. I figured you would. This is completely unnecessary. The board is acting within its authority. My attorney disagrees. So do I. You're turning this into a much bigger issue than it needs to be. If you would just comply with the covenant requirements, Susan, I am complying. I'm not running a business. I'm storing salt in my garage for personal use. Your interpretation of the covenants is wrong, and if you continue to pursue this, you're going to cost the HOA a lot of money in legal fees when you lose. We'll see about that. She hung up. I sat there for a moment, then called Marcus and let him know about the conversation. She's rattled, he said. Good, let me know if she contacts you again. Don't engage with her directly, refer her to me. The deadline came and went. I didn't remove the salt, I didn't pay the fine. The next letter from the HOA arrived right on schedule, informing me that I was now accruing additional fines of $100 per day. According to their math, I now owed $1,200 and counting. Marcus sent another letter, This one more forceful, explicitly stating that we considered the fines to be harassment and that continued enforcement would result in immediate litigation. November turned into December. The first real snow came on December 8th, a Tuesday. It wasn't much, maybe 3 inches, but it was enough that I went out and salted my driveway and sidewalk. I used maybe half a bag of salt. At this rate, 20 bags would easily last me through the winter with plenty to spare. The cold came next, dropping temperatures into the teens and single digits. More snow followed, then sleet, then that particularly miserable mix of freezing rain and snow that turns everything into a skating rink. I kept my driveway and sidewalk clear and safe, using my stockpiled salt while watching my neighbors slip and slide because the stores were already running low on supply. Susan didn't give up, though. The fines kept coming. Every week, another letter telling me I owed more money. By mid-December, according to the HOA's accounting, I owed them over $4,000. They're not going to stop, Marcus told me over the phone. I think it's time to file suit. We'll ask the court to invalidate the fines and award attorney fees. It's going to put pressure on them to settle. Do it. The lawsuit was filed on December 20th. We sued the Maple Grove HOA and Susan Grayson personally, alleging harassment, improper interpretation of covenants, and seeking declaratory judgment that the fines were invalid. Marcus also included a request for attorney fees and costs. Susan was served with the lawsuit on December 23rd. I wasn't there to see her face when she got the papers, but I like to imagine it. Christmas came and went. I spent it with my family in Wisconsin, enjoying the break from work and the ongoing HOA drama. When I got back on December 27th, there was a voicemail from Tom Richardson, the HOA vice president. "Keith, this is Tom. Listen, I think we need to talk about resolving this situation. The lawsuit is, well, it's gotten the board's attention. Can you give me a call back?" I called Marcus first. He advised me not to speak to Tom directly, but to let him handle any settlement discussions. I agreed and gave Marcus permission to talk to Tom on my behalf. Apparently, the rest of the HOA board was not happy with Susan. Tom told Marcus that several board members had not been fully informed about the extent of the fines or the legal situation until the lawsuit was filed. They were concerned about the HOA's liability and wanted to resolve it quickly. "They're offering to drop all fines and withdraw the violation notice," Marcus told me. "Basically, you win. You keep your salt, no fines, it all goes away." What about my attorney fees? That's the sticking point. They don't want to pay them. I told them if they won't pay fees, we'll let a judge decide. That spooked them a bit, but Susan is apparently fighting it hard. Of course she is. The board is meeting next week. Tom says he thinks they can override Susan on this, but he needs time to line up votes. The weather in early January turned brutal. Minnesota winter came down like a hammer, with temperatures dropping below zero and staying there. Snow piled up. Ice formed on everything. The roads were a nightmare, even the main highways that got constant attention from snowplows and salt trucks. The Maple Grove subdivision had its own little internal road system, separate from the county roads. These streets were the HOA's responsibility to maintain, funded through our HOA dues. The HOA contracted with a private snow removal company to plow the streets and salt them when needed. Except the snow removal company had run out of salt. It was a Thursday, January 9th, when everything came to a head. We had gotten hit with a massive ice storm overnight, that terrible freezing rain that coats everything in a thick layer of ice. I woke up to a crystalline world, beautiful and treacherous. I salted my driveway and sidewalk heavily, using up 2 full bags but creating a safe path to my car. The subdivision streets were a different story. They had been plowed, pushing the slush to the sides, but not salted. The roads were sheets of ice. I watched from my front window as cars slipped and slid trying to navigate the gentle curves of our residential streets. Then the school bus came. Maple Grove had its own private school bus service, another amenity paid for through HOA fees. It was actually one of the selling points of the neighborhood when I had bought my house. The bus picked up kids throughout the subdivision and took them to the various schools in the district, saving parents from having to drive or wait at the public bus stops out on the county roads. The bus came down Maple Drive, moving slowly, its flashers on. It reached the gentle downhill slope right before my corner and started to slide. The driver tried to brake, which made it worse. The bus kept sliding sideways, picking up speed until it went off the road and into the drainage ditch at the edge of my property. I was out the door in seconds, running toward the bus. The driver was already getting kids off, all of them shaken up, but thank God, nobody appeared to be hurt. The bus was tilted at a sharp angle, nose down in the ditch, but it hadn't tipped over. Other neighbors came out, helping to get the kids out and making sure everyone was okay. Someone called 911. Within 20 minutes, we had police, fire trucks, and EMS on scene. All the kids were checked out. A few were crying, scared by the sudden crash, but miraculously no one was injured. The fire chief was a guy named Dan Morrison, who I knew vaguely from around town. He surveyed the ice-covered streets, then looked at me since I was the homeowner whose property the bus had ended up on. "These subdivision roads are bad," he said. "Where's your road salt? The HOA is responsible for the streets. They contract with a snow removal company." "Well, somebody needs to salt these roads before we have more accidents. We've got another bus route that hasn't run yet, and we can't send a bus through here with the streets like this." As if on cue, Susan Grayson came rushing up, wearing a puffy winter coat over what looked like her pajamas, her face a mask of concern and panic. "Is everyone all right? Oh my God, is anyone hurt?" "Everyone's fine," Chief Morrison said, "but we need to talk about these roads. They're not safe." "Why haven't they been salted?" "Our contractor said they're out of salt," Susan said, wringing her hands. "The suppliers are backordered. We're trying to find more, but with this storm, everyone's out. You need to find some somewhere. We've got school buses that can't run, and if I have to, I'll close these streets until they're safe." Susan looked like she might cry. Then her eyes landed on me, and I saw the exact moment the thought occurred to her. "Keith," she said, her voice suddenly sweet in a way that made my skin crawl. "Keith, don't you have salt in your garage?" I looked at her desperate, panicked face, at the bus in the ditch, at Chief Morrison watching our exchange, at the neighbors standing around, some of whom had kids who needed to get to school. "Yeah," I said slowly. "I have salt in my garage. Could we borrow some? Just to treat the streets. We'll pay you back as soon as our supplier delivers." The irony of this moment was so thick I could taste it. This woman had fined me thousands of dollars for storing salt, had harassed me for months, had forced me to hire a lawyer and file a lawsuit, and now she was asking to borrow that same salt. "Let me make sure I understand," I said, my voice calm. "You fined me for stockpiling road salt. You said I was running a business and violated community covenants. You've been charging me $100 a day for not removing it, and now you want to borrow it." Susan's face went through several color changes. "This is an emergency." "It's been an emergency every time we've gotten ice and snow. That's why I bought the salt in the first place." Chief Morrison looked between us, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding the context. "If you've got salt that could treat these streets, We really need it. The bus company won't run their other route until the roads are safe, and that means a lot of kids can't get to school. I thought about those kids. I thought about my neighbors who needed to get to work. I thought about Mrs. Henderson, who still had to navigate these streets to get groceries and go to her doctor appointments. Then I thought about Susan Grayson and her ridiculous fines and her harassment. "I'll salt the streets," I said, "but not for the HOA. I'll do it for the neighborhood, for the people who actually live here and need safe roads." "Thank you," Chief Morrison said, relief evident in his voice. Susan looked like she wanted to argue but couldn't figure out how, not with the fire chief standing right there. I went to my garage and loaded bags of salt into my truck bed. I had a broadcast spreader that I used for my driveway and sidewalk, the kind that attached to the back of an ATV, but I also had a big push spreader that I could load up and use manually. I opted for just spreading it by hand from the truck, driving slowly down the streets and shoveling salt out of the tailgate. It took me 3 hours to treat all the main streets in the subdivision. I used 6 bags of salt, leaving me with 14. Neighbors came out to thank me. Some offered to pay me for the salt, which I refused. This wasn't about money. When I was done, I parked my truck back in my driveway and went inside to warm up. My phone rang an hour later. It was Marcus. "You're not going to believe the call I just got," he said, and I could hear the amusement in his voice. "Let me guess. Tom Richardson, Susan Grayson herself. She wants to settle. They'll drop all fines, remove all violation notices, and pay your attorney fees. Full surrender. Because I salted the roads. I'm guessing something happened." She didn't say what, but her tone was very different from previous conversations. "She wants this done. Tell her I accept, but I want it in writing that I can store reasonable quantities of supplies for personal use, including road salt, without HOA interference. And I want confirmation that the HOA will not retaliate against me in any way going forward. I'll draft it up." The settlement agreement was signed on January 15th. The HOA dropped all fines against me, withdrew all violation notices, paid my attorney fees in full, and put in writing that I could store personal supplies including road salt without interference. Susan signed it in her capacity as HOA president, and so did 3 other board members. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Tom Richardson asking if I would consider joining the HOA board. Apparently, several residents had approached him after the bus incident, asking why the HOA had been harassing me over salt that ended up saving the day. The story had gotten around, and people were not happy with Susan. "There's going to be a special election," Tom told me. "Susan's being recalled. 3 other board members are stepping down. We need people who actually care about the community, not just enforcing rules for the sake of it. I don't know if I'm board material. You stored salt so the neighborhood would be safe. You helped us out even after the way Susan treated you. That's exactly the kind of person who should be on the board." I thought about it for a few days. I had never particularly wanted to be on the HOA board. It seemed like a lot of meetings and complaints and petty disputes. But then again, if reasonable people didn't step up, we'd just get another Susan. "Okay," I told Tom. "I'll run." The special election was held in February. I ran for one of the at-large seats, campaigning on a platform of common sense and practical neighborhood management. I didn't have to do much campaigning, honestly. People knew who I was and what had happened. The salt story had become neighborhood legend. I won the seat by a wide margin. So did 3 other new board members who all shared similar views about not being petty tyrants over stupid things. Susan Grayson lost her recall vote and was removed as HOA president. She didn't take it well. Showing up to the first board meeting, I tended to yell at all of us about how we were ruining the neighborhood and property values would plummet and chaos would reign. Tom, who had been elected as the new president, listened politely and then asked her to leave when her 3 minutes of public comment time were up. She left in a huff, and I honestly thought that would be the end of Susan Grayson's involvement in Maple Grove HOA business. I was wrong again. In March, we discovered that Susan had been misappropriating HOA funds. It came to light when Linda McCarthy, who had stayed on as secretary, was going through the financial records to prepare the annual budget. She found discrepancies in the accounts, payments to vendors that didn't match up with services received, and several personal expenses that Susan had charged to the HOA credit card. We're talking about thousands of dollars. A new laptop that Susan claimed was for HOA business, but that apparently only she used. Multiple meals at expensive restaurants charged as board meetings that no other board member had attended. Payments to a landscaping company for work on HOA common areas that was never performed. And when Linda called the company, they had no record of any contract with Maple Grove HOA. Tom immediately contacted the HOA's lawyer, a different attorney than the one who had handled the lawsuit against me. The lawyer advised us to document everything and report it to the police if we believed funds had been stolen. The more we dug, the worse it got. Susan had been padding expenses and submitting fake invoices for at least 2 years, maybe longer. The total amount missing was estimated at around $35,000. Tom called the Plymouth Police Department. Detective Sarah Kendrick was assigned to the case. She was a sharp woman in her 40s with short brown hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She came to a special board meeting, reviewed all our documentation, and asked us detailed questions about how the HOA finances were managed. "This looks like embezzlement," she said after reviewing everything. "I'll need to get our fraud investigators involved, but from what I'm seeing here, there's enough for criminal charges." Susan was arrested on April 2nd. I wasn't there for it, but I heard about it from Ryan, who lived on Susan Street. According to him, 2 police officers showed up at her house at 8 in the morning, and she came out in handcuffs screaming about persecution and false charges. She was charged with felony theft and fraud. The local news picked up the story, running a piece about an HOA president who allegedly stole tens of thousands of dollars from her own neighborhood. It was embarrassing for all of us, but mostly it was just sad. Susan had turned her petty tyranny into actual crime, and now she was facing serious consequences. The HOA had to hire a forensic accountant to fully untangle the mess Susan had made of the finances. It turned out the embezzlement went back almost 4 years and totaled closer to $50,000. The HOA had insurance that covered some of it, but we had to do a special assessment to make up the shortfall, adding an extra $300 to everyone's annual dues that year. Susan's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the county attorney wasn't having it. The case went to trial in September. I was called as a witness, not because I knew anything about the embezzlement directly, but because the prosecutor wanted to establish Susan's pattern of behavior and abuse of authority. I testified about the salt fine, the harassment, and how she had used her position to target me over something completely innocuous. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Susan was sentenced in October to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Her husband divorced her before she reported to serve her sentence. Their house went up for sale in November, and I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that he moved to Arizona to start over. I attended the sentencing hearing. I'm not sure why. Maybe I needed to see it end properly. Susan was given a chance to speak before sentencing, and she used it to blame everyone else. The board for not appreciating her work, the neighborhood for not respecting her authority, me, specifically, for causing trouble and undermining her. The judge was not impressed. Miss Grayson, you abused a position of trust. You stole from your neighbors, people who relied on you to manage their community responsibly. Your lack of remorse is concerning and will be reflected in this sentence. 3 years. Susan Grayson, HOA tyrant and embezzler, was going to prison. I walked out of the courthouse into a cold October afternoon. The first snow of the season was starting to fall, just light flurries that wouldn't amount to much. But it was a reminder that winter was coming again. I stopped at the hardware store on the way home. They had rock salt on sale, getting ready for the season. I bought 20 bags, loaded them into my truck, and drove home. I stacked them neatly in my garage, right where they had been before all this started. That evening, I got a text from Tom. Board meeting next Wednesday. We need to discuss snow removal contracts for the season. Learned our lesson about having backup salt supplies. Suggestions welcome. I smiled and typed back, I'll bring some ideas. Life in Maple Grove settled into a new normal. The HOA became what it was supposed to be, an organization that maintained common areas, enforced reasonable rules, and helped the neighborhood function smoothly. We weren't perfect, but we weren't petty tyrants either. The salt sat in my garage all winter. I used it when I needed it, shared it with neighbors when they ran out, and donated several bags to the HOA's emergency supply that we established after the bus incident. The stores ran out again in February during a particularly bad stretch of ice storms, but Maple Grove subdivision had safe streets because we had learned to be prepared. Mrs. Henderson didn't fall once that entire winter. In April, after the last of the snow had melted, I was working in my front yard when a car pulled up. It was a young couple, probably in their late 20s, and they had that excited look that people get when they're house hunting. "Excuse me," the woman called out. "Do you live here?" "I do." "We're thinking about buying in this neighborhood. Can I ask what the HOA is like?" I leaned on my rake and thought about how to answer that question. A year ago, I would have told them to run. Now, though, things were different. "It's good," I said. "We had some issues, but they got worked out. It's a nice community. People look out for each other." "That's great to hear. We were worried after we read about that woman who got arrested." "Yeah, that was unfortunate, but the neighborhood dealt with it and moved on. We have a good board now, people who care about doing the right thing." They thanked me and drove off, presumably to meet their real estate agent. I went back to my yard work, thinking about everything that had happened. The irony of it all still amazed me sometimes. Susan had fined me for storing road salt, something so reasonable and practical that when the emergency came, my stockpile saved the day. Her stubbornness and pettiness had led to a lawsuit, which had exposed her to scrutiny, which had eventually uncovered her crimes. If she had just left me alone, if she had just been reasonable, she might have gotten away with the embezzlement for years longer. But she couldn't let it go. She had to be right. She had to enforce her interpretation of the rules no matter how ridiculous. And that need for control, that petty tyranny, had been her downfall. I finished my yard work and went inside. The evening news was on, talking about the upcoming city council elections. Plymouth was growing, the suburbs expanding, more developments going up. Each one with its own HOA, its own set of rules, its own potential for good management or tyranny. My phone buzzed with another text from Tom. "FYI, 3 new homeowners moving in next month. Want to help welcome them to the neighborhood?" "Sure," I typed back. "I'll bring the welcome packets." One of my initiatives as a board member had been creating welcome packets for new residents. They included a copy of the covenants, but also a letter explaining that the HOA was here to help, not to harass. We included phone numbers for all the board members and encouraged people to reach out if they had questions or concerns. We wanted people to know we were neighbors first, board members second. It was a small thing, but it mattered. It set a tone. It said that we were all in this together, sharing a community, and the rules existed to help us coexist peacefully, not to give anyone power trips. The next morning, I got ready for work like always. I backed out of my driveway, the same driveway I had salted through the winter, keeping it safe and clear. I drove past the spot where the school bus had crashed, long since repaired and showing no signs of that icy January morning. I waved to neighbors who were out walking their dogs or getting their newspapers. It was just another morning in Maple Grove. Peaceful. Normal. Exactly what a neighborhood should be. At work, my colleague Jennifer asked about the whole HOA situation. She had been following the story because she lived in her own HOA community and had her own frustrations with petty rules. "So, is it better now?" she asked over coffee in the break room. "Much better. We actually focus on important things now: maintenance, safety, community events. The stuff that matters. Maybe I should run for my board." "You should. People who think HOAs are annoying should be the ones running them. Keep them from becoming what ours was," she laughed. "That's actually good advice. Learned it the hard way." The months rolled on. Summer came, and the Maple Grove HOA organized a neighborhood barbecue in the park area by the clubhouse. It was well attended, families with kids running around, neighbors chatting and getting to know each other. Tom grilled burgers and hot dogs. Linda organized games for the kids. I helped set up tables and chairs. It felt like a real community. Not just a collection of houses managed by a set of rules, but actual neighbors who knew each other and looked out for each other. Ryan came up to me while I was manning the lemonade table. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "If Susan had just ignored your salt, none of this would have happened. She'd still be president, still stealing money, still making everyone miserable, but she couldn't help herself. She had to go after you for something completely stupid." Pride comes before the fall. Biblical and accurate. Ryan grabbed a cup of lemonade. "You going to run for president when Tom's term is up?" "God, no. I like being an at-large member. I can contribute without having to run meetings." Smart man. The barbecue went until sunset. Families packed up and headed home, everyone in good spirits. Tom and I were the last to leave, cleaning up the last of the trash and folding up tables. "This was good," Tom said. "Susan never wanted to do community events, said they were too much work and people wouldn't come. People want community. They just want it to be genuine, not mandatory. Truth." We locked up the clubhouse and headed to our cars. The summer evening was warm, fireflies starting to come out, the sound of kids playing echoing from nearby yards. "Hey Keith," Tom called as I was getting in my truck. "Thanks for not giving up. With the salt thing, I mean. A lot of people would have just paid the fine and removed it. You fighting back, that's what started the change. I'm stubborn. We needed stubborn. We needed someone to stand up to her." I drove home thinking about that. I hadn't set out to change the HOA or expose corruption. I had just wanted to keep salt in my garage so my driveway would be safe in winter. But sometimes standing up for yourself on small things leads to bigger changes. Sometimes fighting petty tyranny exposes real crimes. Sometimes storing road salt leads to reforming an HOA. Life is funny that way. Fall came around again, completing the full year cycle. The leaves changed colors, the air got crisp, and the stores started stocking cold weather supplies. I went to the hardware store in October and bought my salt for the season. 20 bags, same as before. I stacked them in my garage without a single worry that anyone would complain. The HOA board had updated the covenants, clarifying language that had been vague or problematic. We explicitly stated that reasonable storage of personal supplies, including but not limited to road salt, gardening materials, and tools, was permitted. We removed the vague business operation language and replaced it with specific, clear restrictions on actual commercial activity. We also implemented financial controls to prevent another embezzlement. All expenses over $500 required 2 board member signatures. We hired an independent accountant to review our books quarterly. We made all financial records available to any homeowner who requested them. Transparency and accountability. Novel concepts for an HOA, apparently. November arrived, and with it the first hints of winter. The first freeze came early in the month. I tested my snow blower, checked my shovels, and confirmed I had plenty of salt. The HOA's contracted snow removal company confirmed they had secured adequate salt supplies for the season and had backup suppliers lined up. We were ready. The first snow came on November 18th, almost exactly a year after I had received that first fine from Susan. I was in my kitchen drinking coffee when the flakes started falling, big, heavy flakes that accumulated quickly. By evening, we had 4 inches. I went out and cleared my driveway, then salted it thoroughly. My neighbors were doing the same. Up and down the street, people were out with shovels and snow blowers, working together, helping elderly residents clearing sidewalks. The subdivision streets were plowed and salted by the HOA's contractor, right on schedule. The school buses ran the next morning without incident. Kids got to school safely. People got to work. Life continued normally, the way it should when a community prepares properly for winter. I stood in my driveway the next morning, watching the school bus make its careful way down Maple Drive. It slowed for the slight hill where it had crashed last year, but this time the street was clear and safe. The bus continued on without trouble, stopping to pick up kids at their designated stops. Mrs. Henderson came out to get her mail, walking confidently on her salted sidewalk. She waved to me. "Beautiful morning," she called out. "Sure is. Thank you for what you did, by the way, with the HOA. Things are so much better now. Just stood up for myself, but you're welcome." She smiled and headed back inside, her steps sure and steady on the ice-free walkway. That's what it was really all about, I thought. Not the rules or the fines or the legal battles. It was about making sure Mrs. Henderson could get her mail safely. It was about kids getting to school. It was about neighbors helping each other and having a community that worked. The salt in my garage wasn't about being vindictive or proving a point. It was about being prepared to take care of my property and help my neighbors when they needed it. Susan had never understood that. To her, the salt represented someone not following her interpretation of the rules, and that was unacceptable. But rules are supposed to serve the community, not the other way around. I went back inside and got ready for work. On the way to my truck, I noticed the new family that had moved in 3 houses down was struggling with their snow blower. I walked over. "Need a hand? This thing won't start," the man said, frustration evident in his voice. "We just moved from Texas. I've never owned a snow blower before." "Let me take a look." It was a simple fix, just a clogged fuel line. I showed him how to clear it and maintain it properly. Then I helped him finish his driveway. "Thanks so much," he said when we were done. "I'm Robert, by the way, Robert Kimball, Keith Anderson. Welcome to the neighborhood." People told us the HOA here was really good. That's part of why we bought here. We try. If you ever have questions or issues, let me know. I'm on the board. Will do. And hey, if you ever need anything, we're happy to help. That's what neighbors are for, right? Exactly. I drove to work feeling good about where we were. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was healthy. People looked out for each other. The HOA supported the community instead of controlling it. We had learned our lessons from the Susan Grayson era and come out better for it. The winter continued, storm after storm, ice and snow and all the challenges that Minnesota weather brings. My salt stockpile dwindled as I used it, shared it, donated it. By February, I was down to 4 bags. The stores still had supply, but I was glad I had bought extra back in October. The Maple Grove subdivision made it through the winter without any bus crashes, without any major accidents on the interior streets, without anyone falling and getting hurt because of icy conditions. It was a successful winter, measured in the boring metric of nothing bad happening. That's the best kind of success, really. When everything just works the way it's supposed to and life goes on peacefully. Spring came, the snow melted, and I cleaned out my garage. I had 3 bags of salt left over. I stored them for next season, knowing they'd still be good. The HOA held its annual meeting in April. We reviewed the year's finances, which were clean and transparent. We discussed upcoming projects, maintenance schedules, and community events. We held elections for 2 board seats that were up for renewal. The elections were cordial, with multiple good candidates who genuinely wanted to serve the community. No drama, no accusations, no power trips. It was boring in the best possible way. After the meeting, several residents came up to thank the board for how things were being run. One woman, a newer resident who had moved in over the winter, pulled me aside. "I heard about what happened with the previous board," she said. "Just wanted to say thank you for fighting back. My last HOA was a nightmare, and that's why we almost didn't buy here." But everyone we talked to said things had changed, and they were right. We all worked to make it better. Still, it takes courage to stand up to that kind of thing, so thank you. I drove home that night thinking about courage. I had never thought of myself as particularly brave. I had just been annoyed about a stupid fine and stubborn enough not to pay it. But I guess sometimes courage is just being stubborn about the right things. The house on Susan's old street sold in May. A nice family with 2 kids moved in. The father introduced himself to me at the neighborhood barbecue in June, not knowing I had any connection to his house's previous owner. "Great neighborhood," he said. "Everyone's been so welcoming. Very different from our last HOA. We work at it. It shows." Summer rolled on, pleasant and calm. I worked on my house, doing some updates I had been putting off. New gutters, fresh paint on the trim, some landscaping in the backyard. All of it in full compliance with HOA covenants, not that anyone was watching with a critical eye anymore. Tom called me in August. "Hey, I wanted to give you a heads up. Someone from the news wants to do a follow-up story on the HOA situation. You know, the whole Susan embezzlement thing and how the community recovered. Do I have to be involved? They want to interview board members." "I'm doing it, Linda's doing it. Would be good to have you there too, since you were kind of the catalyst for everything. I just wanted to keep salt in my garage." "Right, but that led to everything else. Will you do it?" I agreed reluctantly. The interview was scheduled for the following week at the clubhouse. The reporter was a woman named Andrea Chen from a local news station. She was professional and asked thoughtful questions. "So, Mr. Anderson, looking back, do you think the fight over road salt was worth it?" At the time, it was just about principle. I didn't want to be bullied into paying a bogus fine. But yeah, it was worth it. Not just for me, but for the whole community. It exposed problems that needed to be addressed. You think HOAs can be managed effectively without becoming tyrannical? Absolutely. It takes the right people and the right attitude. HOAs exist to serve homeowners, not control them. When everyone remembers that, it works. The segment aired a week later. It was actually pretty good, focusing on community reform and lessons learned rather than just the scandal. Several people in the neighborhood texted me afterward saying it made Maple Grove look good. Life continued. Summer turned to fall again. October arrived, and I made my annual trip to the hardware store for salt. This time I bought 25 bags. I had the space, and I knew I'd use it or share it. The young couple I had talked to in the spring, the ones who had been house hunting, moved in 2 doors down from me. They introduced themselves as Kyle and Amanda Peterson. I welcomed them to the neighborhood and gave them one of our welcome packets. "If you need anything, let me know," I said. "Actually, we heard you're the salt guy," Kyle said with a grin. "The salt guy? Yeah, we read about what happened, with the HOA and everything. That's actually part of why we felt good about buying here, an HOA that learned from its mistakes and fixed things." "Well, welcome to Maple Grove. I think you'll like it here." They did. Everyone did. The neighborhood thrived. Property values actually increased despite Susan's dire predictions. And life was good. 2 years after Susan went to prison, I got a letter from her. It was forwarded through the HOA's attorney, and Marcus advised me I didn't have to read it if I didn't want to. But curiosity got the better of me. The letter was handwritten, several pages long. It started with apologies, which seemed sincere. She acknowledged that she had abused her position, that she had been wrong about the fines, that she had let her need for control spiral into criminal behavior. She talked about therapy she was doing in prison, about recognizing her faults, about wanting to make amends. Then the letter took a strange turn. She asked if I would be willing to speak on her behalf at a parole hearing. She thought that if I, the person she had most wronged, could forgive her and advocate for her release, it would help her case. I showed the letter to Marcus. "What do you think?" I asked. "That's completely up to you. She's not eligible for parole for another 6 months anyway. You have time to decide. Part of me wants to help, if she's genuinely changed, if she's learned something. And the other part remembers that she tried to fine me thousands of dollars for storing salt and only apologized after she got caught stealing. Also valid." I thought about it for weeks. I talked to Tom about it. I talked to Ryan. I even talked to Mrs. Henderson, who surprised me with her answer. "Forgiveness isn't about whether she deserves it," Mrs. Henderson said. "It's about whether you want to carry that anger around. If speaking for her helps you let it go, do it. If it doesn't, don't." In the end, I wrote Susan a letter back. I told her I was glad she was working on herself, that I hoped she learned from her mistakes, but that I wouldn't be speaking at her parole hearing. What she did affected the whole community, not just me, and it wasn't my place to advocate for her early release. She needed to serve her sentence and prove her change through her actions over time, not through my words at a hearing. I never heard back from her, and that was okay. Life in Maple Grove continued. The HOA kept functioning well. We had normal challenges, normal disputes, nothing that rose to the level of drama. Just neighbors working together to maintain a nice place to live. I served 2 more years on the board before stepping down. I had done what I set out to do, helping establish good practices and a healthy culture. It was time for others to serve. The salt remained in my garage every winter, used and replenished as needed. Nobody ever questioned it again. It became part of neighborhood lore, the story that got told to new residents. The guy who fought the HOA over road salt and accidentally exposed corruption. I never set out to be that guy. I just wanted to keep my driveway safe in winter. But sometimes standing up for small things leads to bigger changes. Sometimes fighting petty tyranny makes a real difference. Sometimes storing road salt in your garage becomes a lesson in community governance. And every winter, when the first snow falls and I go out to salt my driveway, I remember Susan Grayson demanding that I remove my excessive stockpile, and I smile. Not because of what happened to her, but because of what happened to the neighborhood. We learned. We grew. We became better. That's the real victory. Not winning the legal battle or exposing the embezzlement, but building a community where people look out for each other, where rules serve residents instead of controlling them, where HOAs remember they exist to help, not to harass. And it all started with road salt.